It was March 7, 1944, on the island of Bougainville, a steaming, rain-choked battlefield carved from volcanic mud and jungle. Japanese officers from the 23rd Infantry Regiment stood over a captured American flamethrower, still warm, its fuel tank hissing faintly, dripping the residue of fire. They had expected to seize a conventional weapon, something that obeyed the logic of rifles and grenades. Instead, they found a device that seemed to belong to no doctrine, no code of honor. They called it the Devil's Breath. One officer later wrote in his field diary, "We thought we understood the courage of the Americans, but this weapon showed us something else. The courage to walk with fire." Lieutenant Kenji Sato, Bougainville Diary, 1944, Imperial Army Archives. The discovery puzzled them. Japan's army had faced tanks, artillery, naval bombardment, even phosphorus shells. Yet this weapon carried no explosive in the conventional sense. It emitted fear itself, a liquid inferno projected from a man's back. And that contradiction, a weapon so small, carried by a single soldier, yet capable of consuming bunkers in seconds, marked a new threshold in warfare's psychology. By early 1944, the U.S. had standardized the M2A17 flamethrower, a refinement of the M1 model first tested in 1942. Each unit weighed nearly 68 pounds when filled, with a twin-tank assembly pressurized by nitrogen. Its range averaged 20 to 40 yards, depending on nozzle pressure and fuel viscosity. The fuel, a blend of gasoline thickened with napalm powder, burned at over 1:200 dan, sticking to everything it touched. It wasn't built for efficiency, but terror. In testing, the Ordnance Department recorded that a 7-second burst could ignite a 12-foot sandbag wall. Production ramped from 200 units per month in early 1943 to over 4,300 by spring 1945. Manufactured at plants in New Jersey and California for 1,020 $750 apiece. The weapon's arrival in the Pacific coincided with a brutal phase of jungle warfare. Bougainville was one of the first battlefields where the U.S. Marines Chemical Warfare Service integrated flamethrowers into small unit tactics. Japanese defenses there were labyrinthine. Bunkers made from coral and coconut logs, tunnels running 50 meters underground, with firing slits barely wide enough to admit a rifle barrel. Grenades could not reach the interior, machine guns jammed in the mud. But the M2 could. It sent liquid flame coursing through the embrasures like molten metal. A bunker could take 100 rounds of .30 caliber fire and survive, recalled Marine Corporal James R. Hughes. But a single burst of flame made every man inside surrender or burn. Sepal Hughes, 3rd Marines, interview, 1947, U.S. Naval Historical Center. Japanese officers had believed their fortifications were impervious. They had measured the load-bearing capacity of each log, most over 25 centimeters thick, and buried positions beneath 2 meters of soil. But by the time American assault teams reached the perimeter, they used combined tactics. Engineers with Bangalore torpedoes, bar gunners for suppression, and a 2-man flamethrower team advancing behind smoke. The weapon's roar, a sustained, hollow thunder punctuated by a deep hiss, disoriented defenders. The sudden bloom of orange light against the rain-dark jungle was not simply a visual effect. It altered the rhythm of combat. Soldiers froze. Radio intercepts captured that paralysis. A Japanese transmission on March the 12th reads, "Enemy soldiers carry fire in tanks. Our men refuse to rise from trenches. Their courage seems broken." Intercept File CX-27, Allied Signal Intelligence. WWII, 1944. When the Japanese officers examined the captured flamethrower days later, their confusion turned to grim fascination. The design was deceptively simple. A pressure tank, a hose, a trigger assembly, a spark igniter. They dissected it under a canvas lean-to, sketching diagrams on ration paper. They noted that the nitrogen cylinder regulated pressure at roughly 2,000 psi. They understood its mechanical logic but failed to comprehend its tactical philosophy. For the Imperial Japanese Army, weapons were extensions of personal valor. The flamethrower replaced valor with systematized dread. It made fear measurable, quantifiable in psi, gallons, and degrees Celsius. Tokyo's ordnance engineers received fragments of those field reports months later. In July 1944, at the Army Technical Bureau in Sagamihara, officers tested a captured U.S. M2 model delivered from New Guinea. Their internal memo summarized the results. Effective range 30 meters. Danger to operator extreme. Psychological effect enormous. They recommended limited development of a Japanese equivalent, the Type 93 flamethrower. But by then, Japan's industrial base could no longer sustain complex production. Aluminum output had fallen to 24,000 tons per month, one-third of 1941 levels. Synthetic rubber was scarce, nitrogen cylinders nearly unobtainable. The few Type 93s produced were heavier, less reliable, and required imported fuel mixtures Japan no longer possessed. Meanwhile, American production only accelerated. The flamethrower became an industrial commodity of terror, distributed with the same logistical precision as rations. Between 1944 and 1945, the U.S. shipped over 20,000 portable units across the Pacific, alongside 138,000 gallons of thickened fuel per month. Training manuals specified that each operator must complete 60 hours of live fire practice before deployment. The life expectancy of a flamethrower operator in combat, however, remained grim: 4 to 6 minutes of exposure before detection or death. Because of that, flamethrower teams were often volunteers. They carried rifles on their backs, though they rarely fired them. Their hands were blackened from soot, their nerves worn thin from the constant hum of pressurized gas behind them. When the Japanese captured that single M2 on Bougainville, they didn't just seize a weapon. They glimpsed an industrial philosophy that contrasted violently with their own. Japan had entered the war, believing spiritual strength could overcome material weakness. By 1944, that belief had been corroded by reality. Every engagement revealed the asymmetry of resources. While the U.S. could deliver 600 tons of supplies daily to Bougainville's beaches by Higgins boats, the Japanese relied on small barges carrying barely 12 tons each under cover of night. Most sunk by P-38 patrols before landfall. They couldn't match logistics with ideology, and yet they tried to adapt. Japanese engineers experimented with improvised flame devices using pressurized kerosene and bamboo tubes. A field test on Luzon in late 1944 burned its operators alive when the pressure valve failed. The post-mortem concluded that the weapon was too dangerous for field issue. The irony was complete. The device meant to instill fear instead consumed those who wielded it. The Americans, for their part, learned quickly that fear cut both ways. Flamethrower teams became priority targets for Japanese snipers. Operators learned to shorten their bursts, conserve fuel, and switch positions every few seconds. Fuel mixtures evolved too. Napalm B, a new compound blending benzene, polystyrene, and gasoline, replaced earlier formulas by early 1945, offering longer adhesion and slower burn. Its chemical properties were catalogued in Technical Bulletin TB-CWS 42-1. Viscosity Index 92, combustion rate 0.7 liters per second, sustained burn duration 15 seconds per 4-liter charge. By the time the campaign moved to Peleliu, the flamethrower had evolved from a tactical novelty into a standard siege tool. Marines assigned them numerical designations in assault formations, just like mortars or bazookas. On September 20, 1944, during the assault on Hill 120, 6 M2A-17s cleared 17 interconnected caves in under 40 minutes. Japanese survivors described the experience with a kind of numb disbelief. The air itself caught fire, one recalled. We could not breathe or see. We could only scream. Private K. Tanaka, Prisoner Interrogation Report, number 211, 1945. In Tokyo, military theorists debated the moral implications. Some condemned the weapon as inhuman. Others admired its efficiency. Colonel Tadashi Mikami wrote privately, "The Americans fight with machinery, not with heart. But their machinery is relentless." Colonel Mikami, Journal Entry, November 1944. That sentence, stripped of its bitterness, was accurate. The U.S. flamethrower embodied the mechanization of fear, a convergence of chemistry, logistics, and psychology that industrial warfare made inevitable. The psychological ripple extended far beyond the battlefield. Intelligence officers noted that Japanese propaganda avoided mentioning flamethrowers entirely, fearing their demoralizing effect. American after-action reports, conversely, treated them clinically, as if describing a new form of engineering. Fuel viscosity maintained at 200 centipoise yielded optimal stream cohesion. Read one such report from the 77th Infantry Division on Guam, July 28, 1944. Behind that detached tone was something unspoken, a recognition that modern war had transcended moral vocabulary. The M2 was not invincible. Its operators were heavy, slow, vulnerable to small arms fire. A single bullet could puncture the nitrogen tank, turning the man into a human torch. Yet, even that vulnerability carried symbolic weight. To wield such a weapon required a strange species of courage, the willingness to carry death on one's back. Flamethrower operators often spoke of the sound, the rhythmic thump of pressure building, the metallic click of the ignition, then the violent recoil that traveled through the hose like a heartbeat. You didn't just fire it, one said later. You felt it breathe. 5th Harold Benson, 5th Marines, Oral History, 1963. The Japanese officers who studied the captured flamethrower could not replicate that spirit any more than they could replicate the weapon's metallurgy. Their empire lacked chromium for the steel alloys, lacked refined fuel, lacked time. But more profoundly, it lacked the industrial culture that made such a weapon possible, one that accepted terror as an engineered function rather than an aberration. By 1945, American flamethrowers had been mounted on tanks, the M4A3R3 Zippo variants, which carried 400 gallons of fuel and could project flame 150 yards. Each conversion cost $20,000 and required 1,600 man-hours at CB workshops on Saipan. They could clear cave networks that artillery could not penetrate. Japanese troops who encountered those flame tanks during the Okinawa campaign spoke of them as if they were living monsters. Caves that had held out for days collapsed in minutes. U.S. Army engineers measured fuel consumption at 0.25 gallons per second. A single tank carried enough for 26 bursts. Reports noted that after-action mop-up teams often found the interiors of caves vitrified, stone surfaces glazed by intense heat. It was a geological as well as psychological transformation. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, hundreds of captured officers were interrogated about their impressions of American weaponry. The flamethrower appeared frequently in their responses. One general described it as the weapon that denied us courage. Another, more bluntly, called it the instrument of despair. Those phrases carried a strange accuracy. The flamethrower did not simply destroy men. It destroyed the idea of honorable resistance. After the war, the weapon's legacy became complicated. In Korea, then Vietnam, new generations of flamethrowers, the M9A1, the M132 mounted variant, carried forward the same principle. Yet international conventions began to restrict their use. The 1980 UN Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons classified incendiary devices under Protocol 3, limiting them against civilian targets. By the 1970s, the U.S. Army had officially phased out man-portable flamethrowers. but their psychological imprint never disappeared. Back on Bougainville, the jungle reclaimed the battlefield. Decades later, a rusted M2 tank was found buried under roots near the Piva River, its valve assembly corroded but intact. Nearby, Australian archaeologists recovered Japanese field notes, sketches of that same weapon, annotated in meticulous kanji. One line translated simply, "The enemy carries the sun on his back." It was not a metaphor the authors intended. They had watched men turn darkness into light, fear into weaponry, and in doing so, witnessed the industrialization of courage itself. To historians, the flamethrower represents an intersection where technological ingenuity and moral horror became indistinguishable. It showed that warfare was no longer about territory or tactics alone, but about psychology, logistics, and the manipulation of human will. For Japan, the captured M2 on Bougainville was a revelation too late to change the war's outcome. For America, it was proof that mastery of production could translate into mastery of fear. When the Japanese officers first pulled the trigger on the captured weapon and saw the column of flame arc through the jungle mist, they realized it wasn't merely a machine of destruction. It was a statement that in the age of total war, the most terrifying weapon was not the one that killed the fastest, but the one that made men question the very meaning of courage. And that is why, in the wreckage of Bougainville's jungle, surrounded by burnt trees and melted helmets, the moment of realization came not with a battle cry, but with silence. Because they understood, perhaps for the first time, that industrial warfare had found its truest expression not in armor, not in aircraft, but in a man who carried fear itself on his back and walked toward the fire,